It could fairly be said that if King Emeric had ever once in his life learned to knock, none of what followed would have happened. But then again, if the girl in the smallest room in the palace hadn't spent 2 years hoarding secrets worth killing for, the king would have had no reason to come looking. So in the end, when the whole court argued over whose fault the entire disaster truly was, and the court did argue, at great length and over a great deal of wine, the only honest answer was that it belonged to both of them and neither would ever agree on the proportions. Marin was on her knees on the north stair when she heard the thing that should not have been possible. She was not, as a rule, a girl who dropped things. 2 years scrubbing the cold stone of Cauldron's palace had taught her hands to be certain, and a life before that had taught her to be quiet, which was harder. She heard everything precisely, because no one ever heard her. That was the trick of being what she was, a sentinel, a girl whose skin gave nothing away, whose fear and whose lies smelled of exactly nothing at all. Alphas looked straight through her. Wolves twice her size forgot she was in the room. It had made her invisible, and invisible had made her useful, and useful, she'd long ago decided, was the safest thing a nobody could be. Which was why she froze, with her rag in the gray water when she heard the footsteps in the servants' corridor below. One set, unhurried, wrong. Servants moved in a scuttle, guards moved in fours, boots, keeping time. This was one man walking alone through a passage no highborn had set foot in for a decade, and he walked like the floor belonged to him, because it did. Marin was moving before she'd finished the thought, down the stair on silent feet, her heart doing something ugly against her ribs. Because there was exactly one door at the end of that corridor that mattered, and it was hers, and it was locked, and behind it was every reason she had to be afraid. She reached the turn and stopped. King Emeric of Cauldron stood at the door of her room with his hand on the latch. She knew him the way everyone knew him, from a distance, from the dais. A young alpha king with winter in his eyes, and a court that smiled at him and doubted him in the same breath. What she had never once seen was him standing 3 feet away in a plain dark coat with no crown and no guard, filling the low servants' corridor until the walls seemed to lean in around him. He was broad and unhurried, and he did not belong here, and the wrongness of it rooted her to the stone. "This one's yours," he said. He didn't turn. "The steward's ledger says a scullery girl sleeps in the last room. I've been told she's been where she shouldn't." Marin's mouth had gone to sand. "Your Majesty," she managed, "there's nothing in there but a cot and a candle. Then you won't mind." He opened the door. There was, in fact, a cot and a candle. There was also every wall. She had told herself on the nights she'd been careful that if it ever came to this, she would lie, that she'd smile and stammer and let them see a simple girl. But there was no lying your way out of what covered those walls, floor to rafter, in 2 years of patient deadly work. The maps, the marked routes, the strung threads of red waxed cord running name to name to name, the intercepted requisition slips. The tally of every barrel of grain and every coin of the crowned silver that had left the storehouses and never arrived, and pinned dead center where she looked at it last thing. Every night, the thing she'd been carrying alone because there was no one left she dared hand it to. A single sheet, and on it, in her own small hand, 3 attempts on the king's life and the pattern that tied them together. Emeric went very still in the doorway. She watched him read it, watched the easy, bored line of his shoulders change into something she had no name for. He crossed the little room in 2 steps and stood before the center of the wall. And for a long moment the King of Cauldron said absolutely nothing, and the only sound was Marin's own pulse and the drip of dirty water from the rag still clenched in her fist. "You're the ghost," he said quietly. He did not turn around. 2 years. The warnings under my door, the night of the bridge, the wine at the solstice, a pause that had a blade in it. "I've had 4 men flogged trying to find out who you were." Marin said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. She had spent 2 years being no one on purpose, precisely so this moment could never arrive, and here it was anyway, a king in a plain dark coat, reading her death sentence off her own wall as calmly as another man reads a supper menu, the red cord catching the candlelight, where it crossed from ledger to ledger. I never meant, who else knows this room exists? He turned then, and the winter had come all the way up into his face. Answer me carefully, girl. Because whoever put this cord on this wall dies the moment the wrong person sees it. And I don't mean by my hand. And that, the plain flat certainty of it, was when Marin understood that he wasn't going to punish her. He was afraid for her. It made no sense, and she had no time to make sense of it, because down the corridor, from the direction of the great stair, came the sound of more feet, several sets. Livery. Someone had noticed the king had wandered off, and someone had come to find him, and they were 30 steps away and closing. She saw the same arithmetic reach him in the same instant it reached her. If the Crown's own men found King Emmerich standing in a scullery maid's room in front of a wall that named half the conspiracy, a conspiracy that clearly reached inside these walls, then this room and this girl were finished by nightfall, and quietly. Emmerich moved. He caught her by the wrist, warm, absolute, unarguable, and pulled her out into the corridor, and pulled the door shut on the whole damning wall, just as the first of the liveried men rounded the corner and stopped dead at the sight of his king in the servants' passage holding a scullery girl by the arm. "Your Majesty," the man began, bowing, eyes flicking to Marin with the beginning of a very dangerous question. And King Emmerich, without a heartbeat's pause, without so much as a glance at her to warn her, said the 6 words that ended the life she built, and began the one she never asked for. "You'll want to congratulate us," he said pleasantly. "This is my quiet bound, my betrothed." The corridor went silent. Somewhere behind her, Marin heard a tray hit the floor. She opened her mouth to say that it wasn't true, that she was no one, that a king did not pledge himself to a girl who scrubbed his stairs, and Emmerich's hand tightened on her wrist, once, hard. "Don't." And she understood with a lurch that whatever this was, it could not be unsaid. Not in front of witnesses, not by a king. There were no takebacks on a crown's own word. The liveried man's mouth opened and closed, and then he bowed, lower than Marin had ever seen a man bow. To her, to a scullery girl, with gray water dripping from the rag in her fist, and the horror of that bow was worse than any blade. Word like this did not keep. By morning it would be past the palace walls, and by the week's end, past the borders of Cauldron itself. And there was not a power on earth, not even the one holding her wrist, that could call it back. He had walked into the smallest room in the palace to catch a spy. He had walked out having married the one person who could hang them both. Marin had spent 2 years making sure no one ever looked at her. By the following morning, the entire palace was looking at nothing else. She woke, insofar as she'd slept, not in the last room on the north corridor, but in a chamber 3 times its size, in the household wing, with a real hearth and a real window and a lock she was fairly sure worked from the outside, as well as the inn. They'd moved her in the night. She had lain awake on unfamiliar linen until the gray came up over Cauldron's frost-bright roofs, turning the same impossible sentence over and over until the words came apart in her hands. "My quiet bound, my betrothed," said in the corridor, said in front of 6 people, said by the king. She'd told herself, near dawn, that it was a mistake she could still walk back. By the time Orla came through the door without knocking, she'd stopped believing it. "You mad, brilliant, doomed little idiot," said Orla, who had scrubbed pots beside Marin for 2 years and had earned the right. She was broad and gray-streaked, and afraid, and she was trying to hide the afraid behind fury, and doing it badly. "Tell me it's a story. Tell me the whole hall's got it wrong, and you did not." "With the king, I didn't do anything," Marin said. "He did it. He said it. I never." "That's worse." Orla sat down hard on the end of the bed. Behind her, Pell hovered in the doorway, with the particular pallor of a boy who has run the length of the palace, to be the first with terrible news, and arrived to find it already there. Pell was 15 and kitchen quick, and he loved Marin with the uncomplicated loyalty of a stray that had been fed, and he could not manage a single word. "Say it, Pell," Marin said. "They're saying you witched him." It came out in a rush. "Down in the kitchens. That a centaur can't be smelled for a liar. So you must have that. You got into his head somehow. That no king in his right mind." He stopped, mortified. "That's what they're saying. Not me." Marin pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. Of course that was what they were saying. It was the neatest story available, and people always took the neat one. A plain scullery girl, the king could not possibly want, and the one thing about her that anyone knew, that her kind couldn't be read, turned instantly into a weapon. It didn't matter that she'd never compelled a soul in her life. That being a null was the opposite of a witch, a locked door rather than a key. The story didn't need to be true, it only needed to be believed long enough to see her burned. And it would spread, because it was delicious. She had stood at the edges of enough feasts to know how a palace fed on a thing like this. The councilman would ask, in that soft, reasonable way that got people killed, whether it was truly safe for the realm, you understand, for the bloodline, to let a creature no wolf could read stand so near the throne. None of them would ever have to lift a blade. They would simply talk and go on talking until talking was enough. "Where's the steward?" she said. "Where's Osric?" Something crossed Orla's face. "Gone up to the king's council before first light. White as the frost. Nobody's seen him since." That, more than anything, put the cold in Marin's stomach. Because Osric was the nearest thing to a father she had ever owned. He'd found her at 11, a null orphan, half frozen at the storehouse gate, worth nothing to anyone, precisely because nothing about her could be trusted or read, and he had taken her in and put a rag in her hand and a roof over her head, and over the years, without either of them ever saying the word, made her his. He was the one who'd taught her that being unreadable wasn't a curse, but a gift, that a girl no wolf could smell could stand in any doorway in the palace and gather what no spy alive could. Every grievance she carried against the rot, in this place she'd learned at his shoulder. Over 100 late nights bent over the ledgers. "Watch where the grain goes, girl. Watch who signs and who profits, and you'll know the shape of the whole rotten thing." The wall in her old room was, in a way, his. She'd built it to prove the thing he'd taught her to see, hoping, if she was honest, to lay it one day at his feet and have him tell her she'd done well. And now, the king had pledged himself to her in a corridor, and Osric had gone straight up to the council and vanished, and Marin could not for the life of her decide whether the man who'd raised her had gone to defend her or to save himself. She got up. She washed in water someone had left warm, an obscenity, warm water, for her. She dressed in the plain gray she still owned and refused, when Orla offered, to put on anything finer, because the one thing left she could control was that she would not play dress-up in her own execution. It was under the wash basin that she found it. A single fold of paper slid beneath the basin's foot, where a maid laying a fire would never look, but a girl who checked corners always would. No seal, no name. 6 words in a cramped, careful hand she didn't know, pressed hard enough to score the page. "Say nothing, or you will burn." Marin stood very still with the note in her hand, and the warm water going cold, and understood 3 things at once. In order, like stones dropping into a well. Someone in this palace already knew what had been on her wall. Someone had been in this room while she slept, and whoever it was had not written to threaten a scullery maid. They'd written to threaten the king's betrothed, which meant that in the space of a single night, without her leave and without her knowing the half of it, she had become worth killing. She was brought to the king at midday, and she went the way a soldier goes to the block, spine straight, hands still, certain of the shape of what was coming, and determined only to meet it well. Everyone had told her a version of it. On the walk, Orla's eyes had said, "He'll cast you off quiet and hope it's forgotten." Pell's had said, "Maybe he means it," which was worse, because it was a child's hope, and she couldn't afford it. The two guards who came for her had not touched her, and a girl learns to read the difference between an escort and an arrest in the set of a man's hands. That, at least, was something. The room they took her to was small and warm and lined with books. Not the great cold council hall she'd braced for. Emmerich was alone in it, which was its own kind of shock. No advisors, no steward. Just the King of Cauldron, standing at a narrow window, with the winter light on him, and when the door shut behind her and the latch fell, he turned, and for one unguarded instant, before the king's face came down over it, she saw that he had slept no better than she had. "You didn't wear the fine things," he observed. "Orla will be heartbroken. She spent an hour choosing them, Your Majesty. She would not be charmed." She had watched charm cross this court like weather her whole life, and had learned it was the thing that cost you. Whatever you meant by what you said in that corridor, you can unsay it now. There's no one here. Tell the court you were mistaken. Tell them the Null witched you if you like. Half of them already believe it. Send me back to the North Stair, and I'll never speak a word of that room to a living soul. You have my oath on it, for whatever the oath of a scullery girl is worth. Emmerich considered her for a long moment. "It's worth a great deal, as it happens," he said, "which is exactly the problem." He crossed to the desk and set 2 fingers on it, and the ease went out of him, and what was left was a young man who had been afraid for longer than anyone knew. "I can't unsay it, Marin. Not because a king's word is sacred. I'd break it gladly to keep you off a pyre. I can't unsay it because the moment I do, you go back to being a nameless null with no one to answer for her. And by the end of that week, you have an accident on a stair. You've become visible. There's no walking back into the dark now. The only question left is whose protection you're standing under when they come for you, and the only shield in this palace that they can't simply cut through is mine." Marin stared at him. It was, infuriatingly, good sense. She had come in armored against cruelty, and found herself unarmed against being reasoned with. "You know what I am," she said slowly. "I know you're the reason I'm alive. And—" he said it simply, without weight, which was somehow worse than if he'd made a speech of it. "3 times someone has tried to end me, and 3 times a scrap of paper appeared under a door no one should be able to reach, in a hand I couldn't trace, telling me exactly where not to stand. Then this morning I walked into a scullery maid's room and found my own life mapped on the wall in red thread." His pale eyes held hers. "I don't want a bride, Marin. I want the mind that built that wall. I've had a court full of clever men swear to me for 2 years that the storehouses are simply badly run. You looked at the same numbers and saw a knife. I need you to keep looking, openly from the inside. With a name they can't make disappear." And there it was, the first thing anyone in this palace had ever offered her that wasn't pity or a pot to scrub. He was not looking at the plain gray dress or the invisible girl inside it. He was looking at what she could do and asking for more of it, and something in Marin's chest that had been braced hard for 2 years loosened a fraction against her will. She hated how much she wanted to say yes. "There's a condition," Emmerich went on, "and you won't like it. From this hour, you trust no one in this palace but me. Not the maids who dressed you, not the guards who brought you, not the men on my own council." He paused, and she saw him weigh whether to say the next part, and say it anyway. "Not the steward, not Osric." The name landed like a slap. "Osric raised me," she said, before she could stop it. Her voice had gone thin. "He's the one who taught me to read those ledgers in the first place. Everything on that wall. I saw it because I know who taught you." Emmerich's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, something careful and closed, a door easing shut on a room she wasn't allowed into yet. That's precisely why I'm telling you. Whoever is bleeding this crown has been doing it for years, expertly, patiently. From close enough to sign the orders in his own hand, a stranger couldn't manage it for a month. It has to be someone the whole palace trusts so completely that no one thinks to check his sums. It is not an outsider, Marin. It never was. And the sooner you make your peace with that, the longer you'll live. She wanted to argue. She had every argument ready. But she thought of the fold of paper under the wash basin, of a hand that had reached into a locked room while she slept, and the arguments dried up in her throat, because they had the awful ring of something she already half knew. Emeric held out his hand across the desk, not a king's hand to be kissed, but a plain, open palm, an equal's, a bargain's. So, will you catch him with me, whoever he turns out to be? Marin looked at the offered hand, and passed it to the man, and she thought of a fold of paper under a wash basin, pressed so hard it scored the page. Say nothing, or you will burn. She had not told him about the note. She realized in that moment that she wasn't going to. Not yet. Not until she knew whose hand had written it, which meant that the very first thing she did inside the King of Cauldron's bargain of perfect trust was keep a secret from him. She put her hand in his. I'll catch him, she said. Whoever he turns out to be. She only prayed the gods weren't listening closely enough to make her keep it. They gave her a room with a table in it, and a key that worked, and for the first 3 days, Marin kept expecting someone to come and take all of it back. No one did. Instead, the ledgers came, cartloads of them, the Crown's accounts going back 6 years, hauled up by clerks who wouldn't meet her eyes. Emeric had told the court she was to have whatever she asked for, and the court, unable to decide whether she was a witch or a whim, had settled on obeying and hating her in equal measure. Marin found she could live with being hated. She'd been invisible for 2 years. Visible and loathed was, if anything, a promotion. She worked the way she'd always worked, by candle, late, her finger moving down the columns while the palace slept. But now, she worked with the King of Cauldron, sitting across the table, from her sleeves shoved to the elbow arguing. It can't be the salt, he said. On the 4th night, salt spoils, salt spills, salt gets weighed wrong. You're chasing a rounding error. 60 barrels leave the harbor at Thornmouth every month. Marin didn't look up. 40. Reach the cellars here. That's not a rounding error. That's a third of the realm's salt walking off between the dock and the door every month for 4 years. And every man who ever signed for the missing 20 is dead, transferred, or too frightened to remember his own name. She turned the ledger and pushed it across to him, tapping a line. But you're right, that it isn't the salt. The salt's just the thread you pull. Look what's holding the other end. He looked. She watched him find it. The same requisition seal, small and unremarkable, appearing again and again beside every vanished shipment, a seal that only 4 men in Cauldron were entitled to press. She watched the boredom go out of his face, and something sharper come into it, and she felt, absurdly, the small, hot pride of a girl who has been told her whole life that her cleverness was a thing to hide, watching a king lean over her work as though it mattered. 4 men can press that seal, Emeric said slowly. 3. Now, one of them died in the autumn. Very suddenly, very conveniently, she met his eyes. I've been trying to tell someone this for 2 years. You're the first person who's let me finish a sentence. Something passed between them then. Not the charm he wore like a coat, but something plainer underneath it. He reached across the table, and for a moment, she thought he meant to take her hand, and her whole arm went still with the not knowing. But he only turned the page beneath her fingers, slowly, so that the backs of his knuckles grazed hers on the way, and neither of them moved, and neither of them mentioned it. Show me the undercroft, he said, and his voice had gone slightly rough. The salt cellars tonight, while it's quiet. If a third of it's walking out, I want to see the door it walks through. She should have said no. A king and a scullery girl, creeping through the storehouses at midnight, was precisely the sort of thing that got written down. But she was learning that she could not, in fact, say no to being taken seriously, and so she took up the ring of cellar keys and a shuttered lamp, and led the King of Cauldron down beneath his own palace, into the dark. The undercroft was older than the throne, low vaulted stone, black with damp, the air thick with brine and cold. Their lamp threw one small pool of gold, and the rest was pure, lightless nothing. Marin went first, because she always went first in the dark. The dark had never frightened a girl who could not be smelled inside it, which was why she noticed the wrongness before he did. The far lamp bracket was empty. It was always lit. The cellars kept a standing flame there against exactly this damp. And it was dark, and the char on the stone beneath it was cold. Someone had put it out recently. And a lamp did not go out on its own in a room with no wind. "Stop," she breathed, and caught his sleeve. "Marin, don't move." She was already listening past him, past the drip of the vault, and there, the smallest sound, leather shifting on stone, off to the left where the barrel stood deepest. More than one, and they were not breathing like men at rest. They were breathing like men who had been waiting a long time in the cold, and were very glad the waiting was over. She did the only thing a null could do that no one else in that cellar could. She reached over and shuttered the lamp completely, and dropped them both into absolute black. The bolt came where the light had been. She heard it split the air where Emeric's head had been a half-second before, heard it crack off the far wall. In the dark she seized a fistful of the king's coat, and pulled, low and sideways off the line they'd expect a man to run, in among the barrels, where she'd counted the gaps by daylight and he had not. Boots scrambled after them blind. A blade rang off stone a foot from her ear. She kept them moving, left, drop, right, the map of the room burning behind her eyes, because in the light, these men would kill them both in 10 breaths. But in the dark, silent and scentless, she was the only living thing down here that knew exactly where the door was. They hit the stair. She shoved him up it ahead of her, turned the cellar key in the lock behind them, with hands that were somehow steady, and only when the bolt shot home and the muffled fury of trapped men rose up through the wood did she let herself lean against the wall and shake. The night guard came running at last. Torches, shouting. It was over. 2 of the men would be taken in that cellar. 2, she'd learned by morning, had a second way out, and were gone. But that was not what Marin remembered afterward. What she remembered was that in the black of the undercroft, in the half-second between the empty bracket and the bolt, when she had gasped, "Don't move," King Emeric had not asked why. He had not startled, had not made a sound. He had simply gone still and ready, like a man who had been half expecting a blade in the dark his whole life, and was only mildly interested to see it finally arrive. "You weren't surprised," she said, when the torches had passed, and they stood in the cold upper passage, both of them breathing hard. "It wasn't a question. Someone just tried to put a bolt through your eye, and you weren't surprised." "Your Majesty, how many times has this happened?" For half a heartbeat something real showed in his face there, and gone. Then the easy king slid back down over it like a visor. "You're bleeding," he said gently, which was true, and not an answer, and she noticed that too. She was keeping score now. And the column of things about King Emeric that did not add up had just gained its first, and it would not be the last. After the undercroft, Marin stopped watching only the conspiracy. She started watching the king. It was not a decision so much as a habit reasserting itself. She had survived by watching. 2 years of being the eyes. No one noticed, did not switch off, because a man had been kind to her over a ledger. So she watched, and what she saw was a man who deflected the way other men breathed. Ask him a straight question about the attempts on his life, and he'd answer it sideways, 3 topics along, and she wouldn't notice the answer had never come until he was already gone. Ask him who he suspected, and he'd tell her she frowned, like a magistrate, and it suited her. He gave her the whole crown's accounts, without a blink, and kept the lower left drawer of his own writing desk locked. And once when she'd reached for it out of pure habit, had put his hand flat over hers on the wood, smiling, and said, "Not that one," in a voice with no smile under it at all. He trusted her with a kingdom's secrets. He did not trust her with his own. Once, she saw him do something she couldn't file. From a gallery window at first light, she watched him cross the frost-white yard to the almoner's gate, where a stooped old woman waited who was no one, no petitioner's token, no place on any list. She watched the King of Cauldron press a purse into the woman's hands with his own, and bend his head to hers, and say something low that made her weep and clutch at his sleeve. Then he straightened, the mask came up, and he walked back inside, as though he'd done nothing at all. Marin never learned who the woman was, and he never mentioned it. It went into the column of things that didn't add up, except it added up the wrong way, because it was the act of a man with something soft and secret he was ashamed to be seen doing, and traitors, in her experience, were not ashamed of their kindnesses. It was the first thing that made her wonder whether the locked drawer hid a wound and not a crime. She told herself it was the work that a woman hunting a traitor could hardly object to a locked drawer. But the truth, and she was too honest with herself not to know it, was that the locked drawer had begun to hurt, and a thing could only hurt if you'd let it get close enough, and she had not meant to let anything get that close ever again. The name found her by accident, 10 nights on. She was in the counting house past the third bell, alone chasing the salt thread further back than the Crown's own ledgers went, into the older books the clerks had half forgotten. And folded into the spine of a 4-year-old account, so ordinary she nearly turned past it, was a single sheet in a hand she didn't know, a receipt for a great deal of silver, paid out quietly from the Crown's coffers, to a name the ledgers never mentioned again. Casimir. She didn't know it, but the page did something. The rest of the ledger didn't. It had survived. Everything around the theft had been buried, erased, made to disappear, and this one sheet had been kept, not destroyed, folded into a book no one would open, as though someone had judged it worth far more kept whole than burned. Below the name in that same unknown hand, 4 words. For his silence. Again, she took it to Emmerich, because that was the bargain. Trust no one, he'd said, but he'd meant no one else. She found him in his study near dawn, and laid the sheet on the desk between them, and watched his face while he read it, because watching faces was the only tool a gnaw truly owned. "I found this in the old salt accounts," she said. "Silver paid straight out of the Crown, 4 years back, to someone the books never name again. Do you know who Casimir?" She got no further than the name. She had seen King Emmerich of Cauldron face down a court that despised him. She had seen him stand in a black cellar with a crossbow trained on his skull and not so much as flinch. She had never, in all of it, seen what happened to his face when she said that one word. The color went out of it. His hand, reaching for the page, stopped in the air and did not complete the motion. And the easy warmth she had grown so dangerously used to, the thing that had made her forget for whole hours at a time that she was a scullery girl playing at courts, it drained clean out of him and left something behind it that she had never seen before and did not understand. It was not guilt. Exactly. It was worse than guilt. It was the look of a man watching a door he thought he'd walled up forever swing quietly open. "Where did you find that?" he said, very low. "Not a question a partner asks. A question a king asks. I told you, the old accounts." She kept her voice level, and her eyes on him, and her heart hammering. "Emmerich, who is Casimir?" For a long moment, he said nothing at all. And when he finally spoke, his voice had gone smooth and careful and very far away, the voice she'd heard him use on frightened councilmen, the diplomat's voice, the one he had never once used on her. "Leave it," he said. "That's not part of what I hired you to find." Hired. The word landed like cold water. She had begun, somewhere in these weeks, to think of it as theirs, the work, the danger, the thing they were doing together. And here he was reminding her, gently, with the door in his face slammed shut, that she was a tool he had picked up and could set down, and that there were rooms inside this man she would never be let into, no matter how many of his enemies she caught. She could have let it go, but she had bled for him in a black cellar 10 nights past, and the stubborn part of her that had begun to believe she was more than useful needed, badly, to hear him say it wasn't so. "You told me the enemy was someone close," she said. "Someone the whole palace trusts so completely, no one thinks to check his sums. You never once said it might be you." It was cruel, and she meant it to be. His jaw tightened. For half a breath she thought she'd finally cracked all the way through to whatever was under the crown, and then the shutter came down. Complete. And he only looked unbearably tired. "It isn't me," he said. "But I can see why you'd wonder. Keep the page if it comforts you to hold it." And that was worse than any denial because it was the truth told in a way that answered nothing at all. "Of course, Your Majesty," she said. She folded the page, and she did not give it to him, and she watched him notice that she'd kept it, and watched him decide not to fight her for it. And as she walked out into the gray, Marin understood that the ledger had gained a second column now, and it was the more dangerous of the two, because it was no longer only someone in this palace is a traitor. It was "the king is lying to me too." She should have left him then. She knew it the way you know the safe move in a game you're losing. A man with a locked drawer and a name he'd go white over was a man to keep at arm's length, to use and be used by and never ever to let in. Instead, over the weeks that followed, Marin fell. It crept up the way the cold did in Cauldron. So gradual, you didn't feel yourself freezing. He came to the counting house at odd hours, with 2 cups of spiced milk, gone half cold from the walk, and set one by her hand, without a word, as though a king delivering warm milk to a scullery girl at midnight were the most ordinary thing in the world. He learned that she went silent, and still when she was thinking, and learned not to fill it. He asked her opinion on things that had nothing to do with salt, a border dispute, a bad harvest, a boy hanged for poaching, and listened to the answers as though they were worth the hearing, and she caught herself, more than once, saving up small clever things through the day, simply to see the surprised laugh she could pull out of him if she timed them right. She, who had trained herself for 2 years to want nothing she couldn't have, was learning to want a great deal that she couldn't. He found reasons to be near her that fooled no one, least of all her. Appearing at the cold end of the east wall, where she walked when the counting-house made her head ache, 2 cups he'd carried up himself, steaming into the frost, pointing out the winter stars as though she were a child who'd never seen them. She let him. That was the thing she couldn't forgive herself for later. How easily, how gladly she let him. And every time his shoulder brushed hers, she braced for some flood of feeling and got only the ordinary heat of a man, and told herself that was proof there was no bond between them, and never once quite believed it. And the worst of it, the truly unbearable part, was that she could never once be certain what was real. He wore charm the way other men wore mail. She'd watched him turn it on and off across a room. When his knuckles found hers over the same page and lingered, was that the man or the mask when he said her name low, like it weighed something? Was that true? Or simply what a clever king did to keep a useful woman close? A null could read no one, and this one man had made himself unreadable right back. She lay awake with her sensible mind in ruins, and hated him a little for being the one door in the world she couldn't see behind. It broke, in the end, in the counting-house, past the last bell, over nothing at all. He'd come in late and sat on the edge of her table instead of the chair, close, and she'd told him to move because she couldn't think with the king's knee at her elbow, and he'd said then, "Don't think," soft, and she'd looked up to tell him exactly what she thought of that, and the words went nowhere because he was already looking at her. And there was nothing lazy in it, nothing performed, just a plain and helpless wanting that she had no defense against because it was aimed for once entirely at her. "Tell me to stop," he said, very low, "and I'll go. I'll never say another word of it. But I'm out of patience with pretending I don't. Prove it," she heard herself say. She would wonder, after, where the word came from. It was the boldest thing she had ever said in her life, and she said it to a king. He kissed her, and every careful, watchful, self-protecting thing in Marin's head went white and silent all at once. His hand came up into her hair. His mouth was warm and certain, and there was no court to perform for, and no advantage to be won, and no one at all to see. There was only the low gold of the lamp, and the cold stone, and the sudden, total, overwhelming fact of him. And then, as her hand came to rest against the front of his coat, something happened that neither of them expected. She felt him. Not his hands, not the heat of him. Something underneath all that, pouring in through the places where they touched. His want, yes, but under the want a great tangled rush of things she had no business feeling, relief, and fear, and a loneliness so old and so deep it stole her breath and threaded all the way through it, unmistakable, aimed at her. Something that was frighteningly close to tenderness. It was his. She knew it was his, the way she knew her own heartbeat, because it was not hers, because she had never in her life felt anything like it aimed at her. The thing he'd named her by in a corridor to save her life, the fated bond he'd claimed as a convenient lie. She had been so certain it was a lie. A sentinel felt nothing, was felt by no one. She was a locked door in every direction, always had been. And yet here it was, real, live, flooding through her from a man who hid everything, and for one shattering moment, there was nothing hidden in him at all. She pulled back an inch, breathing hard, and found his eyes dark and wide and stunned, and knew he'd felt it too. "That's not," she started. "I know," he said hoarsely. "I know. Don't say it isn't." So she didn't say anything, not for a moment. She only rested there against him, forehead to his. The bond opened between them, like a lit window in the dark, and let herself be held by a man who wanted nothing from her but this. Then he pressed his mouth to her hair once, and drew back, and neither of them said the thing they had both just felt, because, to say it aloud, would make it real, and real was the most dangerous thing she knew. He left her at the counting-house door, with a look that stayed with her long after his footsteps had faded, which was the truest measure of how far she'd fallen. Marin, who trusted nothing, holding on to a look like a girl with half her sense. She could not sleep, so when the old ache drove her up to walk, the way it always did, she came out into the gallery at the dead black hour and was there to see one unhurried figure cross the yard below, a shape she'd have known blind, moving not toward the royal wing, but the other way, down toward the old part of the palace, where nothing lawful happened at that hour. She told herself to let it go. She did not. She followed him. She trailed him 3 corridors into the old wing before she lost him. He moved like a man who did not want to be followed, and she moved like a woman who could not be smelled following, and for a while it was nearly even. Past the disused chapel, he went to a low door where the torches had been let die, and there a figure waited for him, bent and small, and wrapped against the cold, and Marin's breath caught, because she knew that stoop. The old woman from the almoner's gate. She was too far to hear. She saw only the shapes of it, the king going down on one knee before a woman who was no one. The old woman's hand coming to rest on his bowed head the way you'd bless a child. And a third shape. Further back, in the dark of the doorway, tall and still and watching, that she could make nothing of at all. Then the door closed, and whatever King Emeric did, in the dead hours in the forgotten wing of his own palace, he did it behind a door Marin had no key to. She went back to bed with more questions than she'd left with, and told no one. The feast for the Sunmark envoy was 3 nights later, and Marin attended it as the king's betrothed, which is to say she stood at the edge of a room full of people who hated her, in a gown the color of deep water that Orla had all but wrestled her into, feeling every eye in Cauldron slide over her and find her wanting. The Sunmark alliance was the whole point of the evening. Cauldron needed the southern clans and their grain and their swords, and the envoy had come north to be courted, and Emmerich moved through the hall, being precisely the king they needed to see. Easy, golden, untroubled. A young alpha, with everything under control. Only Marin, who had learned the man under the mask, could see how much it cost him. The smiling, the endless smiling. Which was why she was watching him and no one else when the wine came. It came on a silver tray, 2 cups, carried by a servant she didn't know, and there was nothing wrong with the servant, nothing wrong with the tray, and Marin would never afterward be able to explain what turned her cold, except that she was a null, and a null's senses were built strange. And where every wolf in that hall was drowning in the perfume and smoke and roast of 100 bodies, she caught, under the wine's dark fruit, a single, thin thread of something bitter and green and wrong. Americ's hand was already closing on the cup. She didn't think. She crossed the space between them and struck it from his fingers, and the cup went to the floor, and the wine bloomed across the stone like a wound, and for one terrible moment, the whole glittering hall turned to stare at the king's mad null bride, who had just dashed a drink from his hand in front of the envoy of Sunmark. "Forgive me," she said, loud, light, dropping into a curtsy she'd practiced badly. "How clumsy, your majesty, let me—" And under it, low, at his ear, in the voice she used for true things, "Don't drink anything you didn't pour. There's nightsbane in it. Smell the stone." She watched his nostrils flare. Watched him catch it, the bitter green under the fruit, and go very slightly gray beneath the golden mask. And then, somehow, laugh, and sweep an arm around her waist, and tell the hall that his bride was right to save him from the North Cellar's worst vintage, and the hall laughed with him, because a king's laugh gives them permission. And the moment closed over like water, and no one but the two of them knew that someone had just tried to murder the king of Cauldron between the fish and the fowl. His hand stayed at her waist a beat, longer than the joke required. And through the thin water-blue silk, where his palm pressed against the small of her back, she felt it again, the quiet, unbidden, a hot, bright pour of feeling straight out of him and into her. Fear, yes, cold and controlled. But under the fear, aimed at her, so fierce, it stopped her breath. "You again. It's always you. You keep pulling me out of the dark." And something else, wordless, that she had no name for, and did not dare give one to. There, in a hall full of enemies. It lasted a breath no more, before he sealed it away behind the golden mask and turned to charm the envoy as though nothing in the world were wrong. But a breath was enough. She had spent weeks telling herself the bond was a convenient royal lie, a word he'd reached for in a corridor to keep a useful girl close. You could not counterfeit what had just poured through her. Not that particular exhausted tenderness, worn down to the grain, which meant the quiet was real, and a true bond to a man she could not trust, was not a comfort at all. It was a hook set deep in the flesh, and every time he touched her it pulled. She stepped out of his hand as though it had burned her. "You have to tell someone," she said, later, when he'd steered them both out onto a cold gallery away from the music. "The envoy's own guard, Osric, someone. Emmerich, this is the second time I've watched you nearly die and you smiled through it. You'll tell no one." All the ease had gone. What was left was iron. "There is a foreign power under my roof tonight, deciding whether Cauldron is worth an alliance. If it gets out that I can be poisoned at my own table, the envoy is on the road south by dawn, and we have a war on the spring wind. No one, Marin, not tonight." His jaw worked. "Trust me, just this once. Trust me and ask no questions. I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" she almost said. Because a man who knew what he was doing did not kneel to old women in dead corridors, or go gray at a name, or keep a drawer locked against the one person putting her body between him and the blades. She let him go back in and be a king. She gave it, A slow count of 100. Then she went looking for the truth herself, and she found it, at last, in the last place she wanted to. She had no plan beyond the certainty, hardening all night, that he was lying to her about something that could get him killed, and that she was finished being kept in the dark of it. So, she did the thing she was good at. She went where she wasn't allowed, and let the palace forget she was there. His study, locked, the council room, empty and cold. And then, following a thread that had tugged at her since the undercroft, she climbed to the wing of the great offices, meaning only to wait outside the steward's door until Osric came up, and watch his face when she told him someone had put Nightsbane in the king's cup. The steward's chambers were dark, and should have been empty, Osric being still at the feast. But a light burned low behind the door, and when Marin eased it open, it was not Osric bent over the steward's private strongbox with the papers spread and the drawers standing open. It was the king. He looked up. For one long, silent, airless moment, neither of them moved. Marin, said Emeric, very calm, very steady, with a sheaf of another man's secrets in his hand. This isn't what it looks like. He never paused. In all the weeks she'd known him, King Emeric had never once been caught without an answer, already waiting behind his teeth. Now he stood in her guardian's ransacked chambers, with the evidence in his fist, and he paused, and the pause told her more than any confession could have. Say something true, she said. For once in your life, no mask. What is this? He set the papers down. She watched him decide, watched the calculation she'd learned to read, cross his face, and then, to his credit, watched him put it away. I've been investigating Osric, he said, for a long time. Longer than I've known you. The words wouldn't fit into meaning. They were sounds. Osric, you're Osric, the steward, the man who raised you. His voice had gone gentle, and the gentleness was the worst part, because it was the careful voice, the one for frightened councilmen, the one he'd sworn off, using on her. The salt, Marin. The seal only a handful can press. The coin bled out of this crown, for years, into House Marrow, who have wanted my head since the day I took the throne. The men in the Undercroft carried Marrow silver. The Nightsbane tonight was bought with it. All of it runs back to one desk, and it isn't a stranger's. And I think in your heart, you have known that for a long time and could not let yourself look. No. The word came out of her small and childish. No. Not him. You don't know him. He pulled me out of the frost when I was worth nothing to anyone. I know exactly what he did. Something moved behind Emeric's eyes, old and tired. He found a girl no wolf could read. A girl who could stand in any doorway in this palace and be forgotten. A perfect, invisible pair of eyes. And he raised her to point wherever he needed her, pointed. Marin, whose grievances have you been carrying all these years? Whose words come out of your mouth when you talk about the rot at the top of this kingdom? You built a wall to prove a thing he taught you to see. Did it never once occur to you to wonder why the one thing your wall never quite touched was him? She opened her mouth and nothing came out, because she could hear it now. Osric across 100 late nights, grinding his teeth over the ledgers, the boy king's too soft to see it. Girl too busy being loved to notice he's being robbed, and she had taken every word of it into herself as truth, and never once noticed the words were not her own. She had underlined a dead man's name on that wall, 3 times over. The seal holder who died so suddenly, so conveniently, in the autumn, certain, to her bones, that he had been the spider at the center of it. Osric had agreed with her. Osric had been the one to set the very ledger in her hands that pointed there. She had built her whole patient case against a corpse, while the living hand rested warm on her shoulder and called her his clever girl. It should have been impossible to feel 2 such different griefs at once. The man she'd loved for a month, revealed as a user. The man she'd loved for 14 years, revealed as a thief. But grief did not cue politely. Osric had not merely robbed the crown. He had robbed her, hollowing out a frightened child and filling the space with his own old quarrel and calling it an education. And the worst of it was that she could not even be certain the love beneath it had been false. That was the true cruelty of a good liar. He made the true things and the false taste exactly alike, so that afterward you could never trust your own memory of being loved. But there was a deeper cut waiting, and she reached past the traitor to find it, because she was Marin, and she always went for the true wound over the survivable one. The corridor, she said. That first day. You knew what I was the moment you saw that wall. You knew I was Osric's ward and the ghost both. And you didn't declare me your betrothed to save me. Her voice was very steady, which was how she knew she was close to breaking. You did it because I was the one thing you'd been hunting for 2 years and could never get someone he trusted, completely, someone inside his guard he'd never suspect. You needed me in the palace, named, protected, close to him, and a drunk fool of a scullery girl handed you the reason on a wall. She made herself say it. It was strategy, from the first breath, wasn't it? For a long moment, he looked at her, and she watched him try to find the lie that would keep her, and fail, because whatever else he was, he had stopped being able to lie to her somewhere along the way. It started as strategy, he said, barely above a breath. Yes, and there it was. She pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes, hard the way she had the morning after the corridor, and the old whisper woke up under everything and made itself at home. See, you let yourself believe it. You let yourself think a king could want a null for anything but her uses. Look what wanting you was actually for. She had heard that whisper her whole life. It had a voice if she was honest, and the voice was her own at 11, kneeling half-frozen at a storehouse gate, with nothing to offer a world that had already priced her at nothing. She had spent 14 years trying to prove it wrong by being useful, indispensable, invisible, worth keeping. And here at last was the proof it had been right from the start, standing behind a ransacked desk with her heart in his fist. A king who had found a use for the one thing about her that no one else in all the world had ever wanted. Not all of it, he said. He came around the desk. She stepped back, and he stopped at once, and the stopping was its own small agony. I won't tell you the beginning wasn't cold. You'd know it for a lie, and you'd had enough of my lies. But it stopped being strategy weeks ago. The undercroft, the wall, the way you say true things when everyone else in my life says only clever ones. I stopped being able to remember why I'd started, because I couldn't see past the name, she interrupted. Because if he touched her, she would forget all of it, and she could not afford to forget. Casimir. That's the drawer you keep locked. That's the door you kneel at, in the dark. You'll bind me to you, in front of the whole court. You'll let me smell the poison out of your wine. You'll kiss me like you mean it, and you will not tell me the one true thing about yourself. Why not me, Emeric? Of all people, why not me? He looked at her, and when the answer came, it was quiet, and it was awful in its honesty. Because it was never mine to tell, he said. And because I was afraid that the moment you knew, you'd understand exactly why Anal could never be safe near this throne, and you'd go. It was not an answer. It was a door held shut with a hand. Good night, Your Majesty, she said, and she turned and walked out of the steward's ruined chambers into the dark of the corridor with her whole heart in pieces on another man's floor. She got 10 steps. Then a voice she had trusted her whole life spoke out of the shadows, warm and grave and waiting, as though it had been waiting there all along. Marin, said Osric, there you are. I've been so worried. Come here, child, and tell me what he's done to you. She went to him. Her feet carried her before her mind could vote, because he had pulled her from the frost when she was 11 and made her into someone who could stand on her own, and standing was suddenly very hard. Steady now. His hands came down on her shoulders, and he looked into her ruined face with those kind, tired, familiar eyes, and Marin felt 11 years old, white as the snow. What's happened? And because it hurt too much to hold, she nearly told him. It was a lie. It was strategy. He used me. The words came all the way up to her teeth. But she was a null, and a null lives by watching. And even drowning, she could not stop her eyes from working. And what they saw, over Osric's shoulder on the steward's own desk, through the open door he did not know, stood open behind him, was a strongbox. Emmerich's ransacking had spilled it, and spread from it plain in the low light, were papers stamped with a seal Marin had spent 2 years learning to hate, and beside them, small and dark and unmistakable, to a nose built strange, a stoppered vial that smelled, even from here, even through the door of bitter green. Nightsbane, in her guardian's strongbox spot, the king had said, with marrow silver. The whole world went very quiet and very clear. Watch who signs and who profits, girl. You'll know the shape of the whole rotten thing. He'd taught her that. He'd taught her to see everything. He had only ever made the one mistake. He'd forgotten she was always watching him too. And in the same cold, clear moment, another thing turned over quietly and locked into place, like a key she'd been holding for months, without knowing what it opened. A fold of paper under a wash basin, the morning after the corridor. Pressed so hard, it had scored the page. Say nothing, or you will burn. She had turned that unknown hand over and over and never once placed it, because there was exactly one hand in all the world she had never let herself suspect, and so had never troubled to learn by heart. She knew it now. He had reached into her room while she slept, to frighten his own ward into silence, and signed it in the one script he was certain her heart would refuse to read. She did not let it reach her face. She had been unreadable her whole life, a curse and a loneliness, and now, for the first time, the only weapon she had. She let herself sag into his hands, and let the tears come, and they were real, which made them perfect. He used me, she wept. It was all a lie, Osric, from the first day. What do I do? She felt him go still with satisfaction. There, now, he soothed. There, I feared this. A king who'd bind a poor null to him for his own ends is no king at all. He's a danger to the realm, child. And the Sunmark envoy is under this very roof tonight. His voice slid warm and reasonable into her ear, and she heard, for the first time in her life, the shape of the thing under it. A word from the right mouth and the south will see him for what he is. Not my mouth, I'm only a steward. They'd say I grasp for power. It must come from someone no one could doubt. It must come from you, his own betrothed, standing before the envoy, telling them what he truly is. They'll believe you, Marin. They'll believe every word. And there are good houses ready to steady Cauldron once he falls. House Marrow among them, she did not say. Yes, she whispered instead. Yes. Take me to the envoy. It was the longest walk of her life, on her guardian's arm, down through the bright halls toward the room where the Sunmark envoy sat, and every step she turned it over, alone, with nothing but her word against the word of the man who commanded every soldier in the building. Because that was the trap, wasn't it? If she named Osric with no proof, she was a jilted, hysterical null, and Osric had the guard, and one wrong word tonight, and the envoy fled, and the war came anyway. She could not accuse. She had to make them look. The envoy's chamber was warm and close and full of the wrong faces. Emmerich was already there, brought, or come of his own account, she couldn't tell, and when she entered on Osric's arm, his whole face lit for half a heartbeat, and then he saw whose arm it was, and the light went out because he thought she'd come to bury him. Your Excellency, Osric bowed low to the envoy. It grieves me beyond words, but the king's own intended has something the South must hear before this alliance is signed in bad faith. He turned, gentle, terrible, the perfect grieving servant. Go on, child. Tell them what he is. Every face in the room swung to Marin. She looked at Emmerich. I'm sorry, she told him with no words at all. I should have believed you sooner. And then she turned to the envoy of Sunmark, and she did not say the thing Osric had built the whole night to make her say. There has been an attempt on King Emmerich's life tonight, she said, clear and steady. Poison? in his wine. I smelled it and struck the cup from his hand at your own feast. 100 of you saw me do it and thought me clumsy. A ripple went through the room. I am a null excellency. I cannot lie to you and be caught, but I cannot deceive you either. For the same reason, nothing I feel will ever show. So do not take my word, take a search. The poison came from a strong box in the steward's own chambers, not an hour's walk from here, and it stands open this moment, because the man beside me does not yet know it. Send your own guard, not the king's, not the steward's, yours. And see whether you find the papers of a loyal servant, or a paymaster's ledger, and a vial of nightsbane that could kill an alpha king. The room snapped tight as a drawn bowstring. Beside her, Osric had gone rigid. This is madness, he said, and his voice was still warm, still grave. But there was a crack running through the middle of it. Now, the poor creature is distraught. He's broken her. Then a search cost you nothing, said the envoy of Sunmark quietly, and nodded to her own guards, and Marin watched the grave honest steward. She had loved her whole life, simply ceased to exist. What stood in his place was something cornered. He ran. He came straight at her, and she saw the knife slide from his sleeve half a beat before he reached her. Marin. Emeric's voice, raw with terror, but this at last was the one thing in the whole poisoned night that she knew exactly how to do. Not with a sword, she had never held a sword, with everything he taught her. She had watched this man move for 14 years. She knew, before he did, which way his weight would go. She turned inside, the knife caught the wrist she'd have known blind, used his own lunge to fold him down, and put the steward of Cauldron face first, onto the cold stone, with her knee between his shoulders, and his blade skittering away into the dark. She leaned down to his ear. "You taught me to watch everything," she said. "You should have remembered. You were part of everything." Then the envoy's guards had him and hauled him up, and dragged him out, and it was done. The room emptied in a hurry of guards and grave southern faces. And then it was only the two of them. And Emeric was staring at her as though he'd never seen her before. "You saved me," he said, again. "Even after, Marin, I came to stop a traitor." Her voice came out flat and cold, and she made it so on purpose, because the alternative was to fall apart. "He drugged the realm's trust and pointed it at you, and it would have meant a war. That's all this was. Not 1 second of it was forgiveness." The hope drained out of his face. "The quiet," he said, low, desperate. "It's real. You felt it tonight. I know you did. Marin, I love you. I don't care how it began. That's the trouble with you." She was already at the door. "You never do care how a thing begins. You only care how it ends up serving you." She made herself look at him, because he deserved to be looked at while she said it. "You looked me in the eye for weeks and used me, and a bond doesn't unmake that. I'm glad you'll live. You'll be a good king, a beat. But I don't trust you. I don't know if I ever will again." And she saw it land in his eyes, the understanding that he had broken a thing that might never come whole as she walked out. She was master of the king's counting house for 5 months, and she was very good at it, and every single day of it she was miserable, and so was he, and the whole palace had to stand around and watch. Osric went to a cell beneath the old fort, and the rot he'd worked into Cauldron for a decade was cut out, root and branch. House Marrow's coin traced, its friends scattered, the salt reaching the cellars at last. The city, which had doubted its boy king, began quietly to love him for it. He had done all of that. He had also spent the same 5 months trying to win her back, and failing in full view of everyone. The flowers came first, a month in. The counting house yard, buried under winter roses at dawn, her own people grinning to see what she'd do. She had them sent to the infirmary and the temple. He tried the council chamber next, where she now sat twice a week among men who'd once have had her burned. He'd catch her eye across the war table, and his whole face would do something hopeful and undefended, and she would look back down at the grain tallies until he stopped. Master Marin, a moment. She always walked out. Anyway, the letters were the hard part. 2 and 3 a week, in his own hand, some a single line, and some running for pages, some not even about her, a posting, a pension, a border ruling, as though her honest word were still worth something to him. One said only, "I keep writing the same word 100 ways. I'm sorry. It's a small stupid word for what I did, and I don't own a bigger one, so I'll keep sending it." She read every one. She answered none. And the warm patient thread under her ribs that she'd spent 5 months trying to smother by neglect refused, stubbornly, to die. Pell and Orla had opinions, of course. "Good," Orla said in the early weeks. "Make him crawl." But the line moved the way lines do. He sorted the back pay. Pell offered one evening. "And he's written you what, 40 times?" 43, said Orla, who had apparently been counting. By the 5th month they'd given up all subtlety. "Master Marin," Orla said, with respect, "talk to the man. You're wretched, he's wretched. And the rest of us have to stand about in the draft and watch the pair of you not love each other to death." "I was used," Marin said. "I'm not queuing up for a second turn." But she went, that night, to the one place in the palace she had sworn never to set foot in again. The small room on the north corridor was exactly as she'd left it, save that someone had taken down the wall. The maps, the red cord, the death sentences, all gone, the plaster bare. Only the cot remained, and the candle, and on the sill, where it had sat for 2 years and where she'd left it the night they moved her in the dark, a small carved sparrow, no bigger than her thumb, worn smooth. Her mother's. The one thing in the world that had been hers before the frost and the gate and the steward. She hadn't dared come back for it. She picked it up and held it, and stood in the little bare room where her whole strange life had turned, and let herself at last be sad. That was where he found her. She heard him in the doorway and did not turn. She knew the tread by now. She thought perhaps she always would. But it was wrong tonight. No guard's escort behind it, no crown's weight in it. When she finally looked, King Emeric of Cauldren stood in the door of a scullery maid's room in a plain, dark coat, no circlet, no guard, no council, nothing at all of the king about him, but the man, and she understood that he had come exactly as he had that first morning, into the smallest room in the palace and stripped himself of every single thing that had made the first time a theft. "You didn't knock," she said. Her voice wasn't steady. "No." A ghost of the old smile terrified underneath. "I'm told it's a failing. I came to give it back." Give what back? The choice. He didn't come in. He stayed on the threshold, on the far side of a line he would not cross without her leave, and it undid her more than any grand thing could have. "I stood in this doorway once and took your whole life out of your hands in 6 words, and I've regretted the manner of it every hour since, so I'm here to undo it properly. There is no betrothal, Marin. I've told the court the quiet bound was my error, and mine alone, that you were free of it from the first. You owe me nothing. You keep your post, if I never see you again. You can walk out of this room tonight, and be no one's, and no one will ever touch you for it. I swear it, on my brother's life." She went very still. "Your brother, Casimir?" He said the name that had turned him gray, and this time he did not flinch from it, and she realized the not flinching had cost him more than the poison had. "My elder brother. The true firstborn, the rightful king of Cauldren. And a null, like you. Everything a wolf king is sworn not to be. The court would have had him quietly dead the day our father died. So I let them crown me instead, and I hid him, and I've paid for his safety and his silence for 4 years. The woman I knelt to in the dark is the nurse who's kept him alive since we were boys." His voice roughened, and Osric knew. He found a receipt I was fool enough to keep, instead of burn, a year past, and from that day, half his hold on me was that he could hand the true heir of Cauldren to house Marrow whenever it served him, as a puppet or a corpse. That is why I could never simply drag him to a cell on a hunch. He carried my brother's life in his pocket, and he knew that I knew it. That's the drawer. That's the secret I'd have burned before I let it near you. Because the day I met a null I could not stop looking at, I knew that if you ever learned a null was the one thing this throne is built on a lie to hide, you'd understand precisely how dangerous it is to be what you are near me. And I could not bear to watch you decide to leave to keep yourself safe. So I said nothing, and I lost you anyway, and I deserved to. Marin stood in the small room, with her mother's sparrow in her fist, and felt the last of it come apart. The cold, careful, watching thing she'd built at 11, and lived inside ever since. "Open it," she said. "What?" "The quiet. You've kept it closed the whole 5 months, same as me. I can feel the shape of it not being there." She swallowed. "I'm tired of reading faces, Emmerich. I've read faces my whole life, and every one of them lied to me, except the wolves who couldn't smell me and the man who couldn't stop. Just once, let me feel a true thing instead of watching for it. Open it, and let me decide with that." He crossed the room. He was shaking, she saw, the king of Cauldron, and when he took her face in both his hands, he did it the way you touch something you're sure will be taken from you, and he let the quiet open, all the way. No mask, no angle, everything. It poured through her. There was no strategy in it. She'd have felt strategy. She knew its taste from the ledgers. There was only the plain, enormous, undefended whole of him, 5 months of grief, the exact twin of her own, and terror, and a love so total and so hopeless, it had stopped trying to be anything but true, and under all of it, quiet and steady and asking nothing. A thing she had spent her whole life certain she would never be given. He was not weighing what she was worth. He simply wanted her, for no reason but wanting. And, fool that she wanted him back. "Ask me," she whispered. He understood. Of course he did. He always had, under the mask. He went down on one knee in the smallest room in the palace, before a girl who scrubbed his stairs, with no crown and no takebacks and no 6 easy words, only the hard ones, the ones that were a question and not a sentence. "Marin," he said, "will you have me? Not the king, me. You can say no. That's the whole of the gift. You can say no." She looked at him a long moment, because he deserved to be looked at. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said, and watched his face begin to fall. "When I slept, and you've slept, and you can remember every word of it, ask me every day until I believe you can't stop." She closed her hand around the sparrow and around, somehow, the warm live thread of him. "And then I'll say yes." It took him 101 days. He asked her sober, in every way a man can be sober, and a few, no dignified king should attempt. He asked across the war table until Orla threatened to resign in writing. He asked on the east wall, with cocoa going cold in his hands. He asked badly and beautifully, and once with so many roses the counting house smelled like a funeral for a week. And every day Marin told him to ask again tomorrow until one perfectly ordinary morning, over bad porridge, she looked at the man grinning hopefully at her across the table, and simply said, yes. The whole city came out for it, the boy king no one had believed in, and the null nobody had ever bothered to look at, who'd seen the man behind the smile before anyone else troubled to. Gadjamir stood at his brother's shoulder, unhidden at last, and no one dared say a word, because the king had a way now of daring them to. Emmerich wept during the vows. Marin had known he would. She hadn't meant to, but the quiet gave her away, and he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw. "You're stuck with me now," he murmured, when it was done. "I came into your room unannounced and everything." "No taking it back." "Why would I take it back?" said Marin. "When I'm the one who let you in?" She turned the small carved sparrow over in her fingers. worn smooth, and tucked it into his hand to keep. Best door I never locked. He decided that was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him, and for once she didn't argue.